And this weekend, Northwest Vine Time back in Seattle on the south side, actually in South Park here at OS Winery. And we're glad to be here this weekend with Owen, the winemaker. Owen, thanks for the invite. And I'm excited to taste these wines coming up in about 30 minutes in our tasting room segment. We will enjoy your wine, but first, everybody wants to hear your story because so many of my friends across Seattle have been here for events or tasted your wines. This is our first trip here, so why don't you tell us your story?
Well, to begin with, I grew up in a food and wine household in which sitting down with the family was an every night event, and both my parents were top-notch cooks, and so that was the start. And my father was a hobbyist with rhododendrons. We had 180 different rhododendron species and varieties, and said, well, I will be a landscape guy. And I started out that way, and eventually I fell right in to working in restaurants, almost by accident. When I did that, it was all over. My first supervisor was Tony Kishner, who ran the Shelbourne Inn on the coast for 20 years and still has a place in Astoria, and would go home and would be drinking the best wines in the world at the time after work because they were affordable back then. And then within a short time, I was a sommelier at Girard's Relais de Lyon. And I did that for several years. I worked in wholesale and retail, and eventually one of my best friends, Chris Camarda, had just started Antelope Winery on Elliott Avenue at the time, and I helped him, and then he moved to Vashon, I moved to Vashon, I went to work for him, and I just happened to stumble into somebody who had the money to help me get started. And that's how we did it. But throughout our whole career, I based the wines that I make on the models that I had learned in the wine trade about what constituted top-notch balance. And I still work off of that principle.
Well, let's talk about that, because you had told me before we hit the air here that you grew up in a family where your mom was quite a cook. So this actually probably started when you were a kid then, right?
It did indeed. I was blessed with music, art, and food. Literally every night, my mother would shop for 2 hours after work and cook for 2 hours. Seems hard to believe, but she did, because she's an anesthesiologist, and she did that.
Let's talk about the time frame here too, because when you came up in the wine industry, it certainly wasn't what it is today. I mean, the Washington industry has grown exponentially in the past 20 years, and with all the great winemakers and vineyard owners we've talked to on this show, it really is amazing to see, and you've been a big part of that.
When I got started in '75 in the wine trade, St. Michel was just getting off the ground as a part of American Tobacco. Wow. And one of their divisions. And European wines were largely reputation, and for the most part, not what we'd consider to be great wines. But there were great wines being made, and I got to taste a lot of them. And working in a French restaurant, we covered the whole scope. We had American wines that were very good. We had German wines, we had Spanish wines, and a great collection of French wines. So it was a tremendous education for me, and I took to it like the duck to water.
Well, talk about that, because when you're working in a restaurant, obviously you're going to develop your own palate for what you like and what you don't like. How did that impact you, and how does it impact you now as a winemaker?
Well, one thing when working in a restaurant or wholesale or retail, your first focus is the customer. What do they like? And you have to learn that, and you have to practice it. And many of us often forget it. It would be liars if we didn't say it. But that's what I believe today. Now, I have my own standards for what I consider, the perfectly balanced wine, and the wine that is just irresistible. And at this point, I think we're making those wines that not only do I find irresistible, but our customers do.
I'm looking forward to tasting those wines coming up in our tasting room segment here past the bottom of the hour. And to reset the scene for our listeners across the Northwest, syndicated on the Radio Northwest Network, this is Northwest Vine Time, and this weekend we're at OS Winery just across from Georgetown. Those of you across Puget Sound familiar with that area in South Park here across from the river. And we're with Owen, the winemaker here. And Owen, it's got to be kind of like living the dream for you, because you said earlier you had to be patient, and you were, and here you are with your dream job.
There are a few things I think that are more fun than being a winemaker. certainly in this situation. Both my parents were doctors. Well, that's fun, but by the end of their careers, it was not as much fun as I'm having now. And it's also very serious. There's a lot of money on the line. You have to work with dozens of people in various aspects of supply and sales. And I enjoy every minute of it, really. I wake up in the morning, I get myself ready, I get on my bicycle, I ride 10 miles to work from Vashon to South Park, and I'm raring to go.
Let's talk about your financial partner here too. I mean, you had the dream, you had the experience, and tell us how you sold him on this venture. I mean, I know it probably wasn't easy.
I don't know what to tell you. I must have something that I don't know about that went into play when Rob said, "Sure, why not?" I can't answer that question, but he just really enjoyed being part of it, and now his daughter is really stepping up in his position and a couple other positions. So we're all excited about that. Rob is just saying, "I'm going to spend more time on the boat."
Well, when you say, hey, let's start a winery, I mean, it sounds romantic, and I know that a lot of people would like to do that, but it's a big financial commitment to get it off the ground, isn't it?
That is true, and I'd say since no later than my 55th birthday, my MO has been, don't worry, be happy. Worrying will get you nowhere. I try and be as responsible as I can about everything I purchase and everything I bottle. To keep the financing as good as it can be, or the financial picture as good as it can be. But many of my friends are wine producers whose families have been doing it for decades and centuries in some cases. And they're sort of my models for the way it ought to be, and they inspire me. And so to answer the question about, well, the money on the line, you deal with it every day. You say, what's the best thing I can do this day to make things better? Mm-hmm.
My first trip here to OS Winery, I've had friends across Seattle tell me about it though, and they're very impressed. In your mind, what is it that separates your wines and your winery from others, not only across Seattle and Woodinville, but across Washington and the Northwest?
There are many good wineries in Washington, and I think that the main thing that separates our wines in general from many of the wines in Washington is my idea of balance and alcohol. My alcohol progressively for my red wines, has dropped to 14 or less. And I have a fabulous Cabernet Franc coming out for the 11 vintage that's 13%. My Riesling, ever since I started making, is the only Riesling in Washington history that adheres pretty much to the German model. It's always under 10% alcohol with 20 to 30 grams of residual sugar. This year's straight up 9%. It's a classic German Cabernet made in Eastern Washington. But I think, they wrote the book on the model, mm-hmm. and, off dry Riesling and dry Riesling. And I go there every year, I taste their wines. I am admittedly a little Riesling obsessed. Reverend Riesling is a title I am occasionally addressed by.
Well, that's good to hear. So let's talk about that, because if you're keeping your alcohol consistent year after year, how do you do that when we have cool vintages and sometimes we have hot vintages which will produce a higher alcohol wine?
Well, the general public is generally not aware of this, but throughout California and Washington, water is used to adjust the sugar level of the must when you crush. You can't do anything once you've started to ferment the wine, but it's called watering back. And in the 11 vintage, which is our coolest vintage, only one lot required that. Everything else had low sugars, but I aim to be no higher than 23 bricks, which is essentially 23 mm-hmm. and a half, which is 14% alcohol potentially. And so I remove juice from the crush and replace it with water to keep the liquid level constant in the fermentation. And in the Riesling, I harvest at the earliest possible point when it's got delicious flavor but low sugar.
You're giving away some secrets. We appreciate it. Owen, the winemaker here at OS Winery this weekend. If you're just joining us, stay with us. We're up against the break here on Northwest Vine Time. We're in South Park, in the south part of Seattle, right across the river from Georgetown. When we continue, we'll talk more about the vineyards and the varietals that they're producing here at OS Winery. A little bit later in the show, after the bottom of the hour, it's our tasting room segment on location this weekend in the Seattle area here on Northwest Vine Time. And Northwest Vine Time continues this weekend. We're on location back in Seattle in South Park at OS Winery with Owen the winemaker. And a friendly reminder for our listeners across Puget Sound, the new KIRO radio app is available. You can download all the new free KIRO radio app for iPhone, Android. You can listen to KIRO radio, over 10,000 hours of searchable archived audio from the past 5 years. Just go to My Northwest or KIROradio.com. Back with Owen here in South Park. Thanks for having us this weekend. We're glad to join you and your many fans here in the South Park area at OS Winery. And let's talk about vineyards. I know that this is something near and dear to you because that's really where it all starts, isn't it?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. When I started, I had the blessing of having worked with Chris Smart at Andrew Will, who at that time worked with 3 or 4 of the most famous vineyards in Washington. And 2 of those were on Red Mountain. One of them is Shampoo Vineyard in Horse Heaven Hills. So those are the vineyards I started working with. And then while I worked for him, I met Scott Greer, who was just starting to develop Sheridan Vineyard in Zillah. Okay. And soon as he was up and running, I was pretty much his first customer. And I continue to be one of his larger customers. And he's in the Western Valley, the opposite end of the valley from Red Mountain. And over the years, I developed a strong preference for Western Valley fruit. And currently, we are getting 1/3 of our fruit, maybe a little more, from Elephant Mountain Vineyards, which is just 15 minutes from Yakima, the top of the ridge, the northern ridge of the Yakima Valley, and at 1,500 feet at the top of my Merlot and Cabernet blocks. And then Sheridan, 2 Blondes, and Deneen Vineyards, which are my other 3 sources, are contiguous vineyards that are 5 miles east of there. So it's a tight little block, and each one of them has distinction. I make Cab Franc from all of them, and it's a real treat to taste them as they develop and see, wow, here's Deneen, here's Sheridan, and here's 2 Blondes, which are contiguous vineyards, but each one of them has a very distinctive style. And then Elephant Mountain, 5 miles away, has the one thing that none of the aforementioned vineyards have, and that is consistent tannic structure of a muscular sort, which is not necessarily everybody's cup of tea, but it's something that a lot of people cherish and prize. And so if I want to make a wine that's got beautiful tannins, Elephant Mountain. If I want to make a wine with silky but very firm tannins, Sheridan. If I want to make a wine that's lush and sort of velvety, Deneen. And then Deneen has delivered me maybe the best Riesling fruit I've ever had last year, and I'll get it again this year.
It's interesting. You've got vineyards that literally are right next door to each other, and yet the flavor profiles are dramatically different. Why is that?
There is a serious elevation difference between, say, and we'll just take those 3 contiguous vineyards. Elevation is the main thing. Sheridan's at the top, 2 Blondes in the middle, Deneen at the bottom, and that really accounts for it. And I think you get real technical if you got into, well, what causes that? But I've tasted it for years and work with it, and it's a pleasure. One of the pleasures of being a winemaker is you get to taste those before you blend them, if you do. Or in the bottle, the customer can probably go out and taste wines from each vineyard. But to taste the wines from each vineyard as I make them, which can be instructive, you pretty much have to come here.
Let's talk about the soil too. Is there a difference in soil in those elevation changes at all?
Well, one thing all 4 vineyards have that is totally different than what you'd see in Red Mountain or Shampoo, which are much lower elevation, where the Clark floods 13,000 years ago deposited deep loess layers up to, say, 600 feet, and that includes those 2 vineyards, the Red Mountain vineyards and Shampoo, among others, whereas the Zillah vineyards and Elephant Mountain are much higher up, and if you can just visualize the water flooding down but not up that high and dropping far less in there, and so it has rockier soil, what's called cleachy. We have a block right here. It looks like marble, but it's a calcareous deposit, and when you plant a vineyard there, it's about 2 feet deep, and you have to take a D9 caterpillar and rip it with a big claw to be able to plant the vines there. And so a big difference in that kind of soil. So Sheridan in particular, when he started, he struggled to, and he didn't want more than 2 tons an acre. Now, for me, with our climate, 3 tons an acre is generally sort of a sweet spot for my best wines. And I can do real well at 4 tons an acre for my less expensive wines and get fabulous fruit from some of the vineyards. But the climate, you could get 8 tons an acre in those warmer places, but you know, most of those people don't do that. So there's a significant difference in the best Western Valley vineyards than there is to the more well-known ones, which are some of the original vineyards in Washington, in Red Mountain and Shampoo Vineyard.
Oh, and it's moments like these that I'm so happy that I actually paid attention back in science class in 7th grade, so I understand what you're talking about here.
Well, I pretty much learned a lot of science. It's like my French. The French went in one ear and out the other, but when I went to Morocco, I could speak it. It was their second language, and I've learned incredible amounts of science making wine, and about not just winemaking science, but electrical science, because you have to have electrical equipment and physics. So you have to pay attention, and I wish that more people, they always say, oh, you're a scientist. No, I'm a winemaker.
But there is a lot of science involved in this, and I can tell it's your passion. And when we come back, we will get to taste these wines here. For those of you just joining us up against the break here, this weekend, Northwest Vine Time on location in South Park, just south of Seattle, right here at OS Winery with Winemaker Owen. When we come back, we'll have our tasting room segment. A little bit later, I want to talk to Owen about this bicycle over here. 65 years young and still riding many miles every day. A great lesson for all of us here across the Northwest. We'll talk about that, wine, and a whole lot more as Northwest Vine Time continues here this weekend in South Park on the Radio Northwest Network. And we're back on Northwest Vine Time this weekend in South Park, just outside of Seattle at OS Winery with Winemaker Owen. And thanks for the invite here. It's our first trip, and it's been a lot of fun so far. For those of you just joining us, if you've missed the last half hour of Northwest Vine Time, we will podcast on mynorthwest.com. And for our listeners in the Portland and Oregon markets, head to kxl.com for this podcast. Okay, Owen, let's talk wine here with you now. This is our tasting room segment. And during the break, we talked about Riesling, which is one of my favorite varietals. And there's so much talk across the Northwest. In Oregon, it's all about Pinot Noir. Across Washington, amazing red blends. But I'm excited to talk Riesling with you because you really know what you're doing here.
Well, when I started in the trade, the German wine producers had a very good decade, the 70s. And at that time, if you ask me, those were the best wines with the highest quality, the most complexity, the best aromatics, the greatest length, and by far the greatest cellaring potential. They last forever. And for the short term, like 10 or 20 years, you don't need a special cellar for them because they have a very low pH compared to red wines. Mm-hmm. So that was something that I ran into initially, and I was able to taste a horizontal of probably the greatest German wine, the Schwarzhofburger from Egon Müller in '76, which would be the Cabernet, the Spätlese, 5 different foeders of Auslese, different, same level, but different, parts of the vineyard. And these are vines planted in 1880, I should point out, and then a Beerenauslese and a Trockenbeerenauslese. So once you've gone through that and similar tastings, I really like Riesling. And at this point, as a producer, I long ago learned that Riesling allows you to do almost an infinity of styles, where most red or white varieties allow you to do 1 or 2 things, and that's about it. So if you like to experience different styles from the same vineyard or nearby vineyards and the same grape, then Riesling is just about the only variety that you can just blow your socks off wines out of. And currently I have a dry Riesling and what in Germany would be called a Cabernet. The dry Riesling has around 10 grams of residual sugar and the Cabernet has around 30. And I've always worked with vineyards that have a very low pH, 3.0, consistently, and 7.5 to 8.5 grams of acidity.
Yeah, my family's from Germany, but I flunked out, I think, my freshman year in high school. So you lost me there partway through the conversation with all your German, but the wine speaks for itself, Owen.
Well, I was stunned the first time I made Riesling, and certainly subsequent time, because I tasted all these German wines which come from 80+% slopes in almost pure slate, and my vines are at relatively low altitude with no slope to speak of, and deep soil and no slate, of course, and I got a similar result. So I believe in terroir, but it is shocking. Yeah. And certainly my 09 vintage could be put in a flight of Mosel wines and nobody would know it was a Washington wine.
At OS Winery here in South Park, south of Seattle, Brian Bushlach alongside Owen, the winemaker here. And it's interesting you talk about Riesling, because when we talk about it, I think many people who aren't familiar with this varietal, they try it in a tasting room. Maybe they try one that has a little higher alcohol or more sugar in it, and it may taste good in a little burst in a tasting room. They buy the bottle, get it home, and have a glass, and it's very overpowering, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I totally believe in the German model, which if you're having 20 to 30 grams of residual sugar, you should just stay away from anything over 10% alcohol, and I have done that. My current wine that's about to be bottled is 9% straight up, and they've varied from 9.5 to 9.8 over the years. My dry one, the less residual sugar you have, the more alcohol you're going to have anyway, but you always aim for balance. And I'm very critical when I'm making the wine about how is my balance, and that stands true for red wines. You want all the pieces of the wine to fit seamlessly together and deliver pleasure that makes people stand up and say, wow.
Well, it definitely is a wow on that wine. And speaking of reds, Owen, I'll let you pour our next wine while I remind our listeners across the Northwest on the Radio Northwest Network, we are in the Seattle area this weekend in the South Park neighborhood here, just south of Georgetown. For those of you in Seattle, I know you're familiar with it, but we're on location at OS Winery with Owen, the winemaker here. And Owen, let's talk about the next wine. What do you have for us here?
We have the Bordeaux blend, the 09 red, which is 40% Cabernet, 40% Merlot, and 20% Cab Franc. 1/3 New French oak, 3 years in the barrel, just 14% alcohol. A beautifully balanced wine, if I say so myself. We've been selling pallets and pallets of our 08 red and just going into the 09 red. And so far my sampling of the 10 says it might be even better. So we're going to taste it right now.
Let's do it. Now, is this the one that you told me you think is the best value red wine anywhere in the world?
If you're buying it here in Seattle, absolutely. At $15 retail or less, if you're lucky. I've looked for competition. I haven't found any yet.
Okay, well, lay it on me. Owen here at the OS Winery with the 2009 red. You said, do you still have 2008, or is that sold out?
It's sold out.
Okay.
So I forgot to say, in my humble opinion.
Oh, okay. We had to qualify that statement. So in your humble opinion, here we go with the pour. And a friendly reminder for those of you, while we're pouring wine here, the new KIRO radio app is available for our listeners across Puget Sound. You can download the all-new app for iPhone and Droid at KIROradio.com or visit mynorthwest.com, and you can take us wherever you would like to. Okay, Owen, tell us about this wine.
Well, it's a blend of Cabernet Merlot and Cabernet Franc from Sheridan, Two Blondes, Elephant Mountain, and Shampoo. The Merlot, a part of the Merlot portion is from Shampoo, and the rest is from Elephant Mountain and Two Blondes. A big chunk of the Cabernet is from Elephant Mountain, and that delivers some of the tannic structure in the wine. It's got beautiful aromatics, tremendous mouthfeel, and it's drinkable. One of the things I love about under 14% reds is the drinkability factor. We have 3 people making wine here, my son, my assistant Dennis, and myself, and every day one of us cooks lunch. And we always have wine with our lunch, and it allows us to see, well, how is this wine to drink? And too many wines for me are too hard to drink because there's too much alcohol. And so this wine, I think, is eminently drinkable.
That's a great wine. It is very drinkable, and you said this is your 09, correct?
Yes, indeed.
That's a beautiful wine. Now, when you go into this blend process too, do you keep it pretty much the same year in and year out, or do you kind of go in for the feel?
To some degree, I keep within a model, but you have to make the best wine you've got with the components that you have, and you have to figure out, well, how much new wood is appropriate, and at this price, that dictates a fair amount of that. There's a lot of new wood in this for that, but it's had 3 years to evolve, and you really can't taste it. And one of my firm preferences in blending and making wine in general is the consumer should never go, wow, how about that barrel aroma, or how about those barrel flavors? And I say barrel as opposed to oak, because barrels really involve the oak and the toasting process together that give you the flavor. And those should always, in my mind, be integrated into the wine and not be obvious as barrel flavors to anybody but maybe the winemaker.
That's a great wine. I can't believe you're selling that wine at 15 bucks. Are you kidding me?
It hurts.
Must be your marketing guy, huh? Blame it on him, right?
Yeah, I guess.
I mean, that is a great wine. We're at OS Winery in South Park this weekend here on Northwest Vine Time, airing regionally on the Radio Northwest Network, across Puget Sound on KIRO Radio at 97.3, and in Portland on FM News 101 KXL. I don't think we're going to have time to get to the next wine. We'll pour that during the break, and we'll save that for the final segment. But this is the first time I think I've seen a dump bucket that resembles a doggy dish.
It is indeed. That's my dog Rosie's bowl.
And what happens if Rosie gets into this and you haven't dumped the dump bucket?
No, this is South Park, and Rosie lives on Vashon, so it probably won't happen.
Oh, okay. She's not here in the. Okay, I thought she might be here in the tasting room, and then we might have an issue. So, okay, that's good. Good to clarify that, Owen. When we continue here from OS Winery in South Park, we'll talk more about our next wine here, and we'll tell you how you can get down here and enjoy it. We'll talk more about the tasting room with Owen when we continue here on Northwest Vine Time. And we're back to wrap up this edition of Northwest Vine Time on the Radio Northwest Network. KIRO Radio at 97.3 across Puget Sound, FM News 101 KXL in Portland, and the Radio Northwest Network. We're at OS Winery in South Park on the south side of Seattle this weekend with the winemaker Owen. And before we taste this final wine here, the Sonus, there's some history here, isn't there?
There is indeed. It started with my first vintage of Sheridan fruit, which was Cabernet and Merlot. And I was just shocked at how good it was. And some very senior professionals in the wholesale trade tasted it, and that was their response. Thought that both varieties were special, and so that meant that I had to make a blend of them, which I did. And we had to come up with a name. So one day in the shower, out of nowhere, I thought, Ulysses, because it was the 100th anniversary of the book. It was Sheridan's name derived from Phil Sheridan, who worked for Ulysses S. Grant, and of course there's Homer Simpson as Ulysses in the Iliad and the Simpsons. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I thought that's a great name, and everybody bought it, and so we put it on the label, and it was wonderful. The next vintage we had Cabernet Franc, and that's when it really took off, because then we had the trio together, and the Cabernet Franc has always been a smaller percentage in it, but it really, on a certain level, defines the wine. It's a character that might occasionally be mistaken for an exotic Pinot. Often thought, oh God, is this Saint Emilion I'm drinking? It's, I think, easily identifiable by its unique flavors, which I don't want to prejudice anybody by giving them descriptors, but delicacy and finesse and silky texture have always been a part of this blend.
Approachable too, very nice wine, yeah.
Very approachable, but we had the 04, the 03, and the 02 recently, and they're very fresh at this point. They're excellent cellaring wines, very sturdy, but quite distinctive. Fun to have Ulysses, or now Sonus.
And what's behind the Sonus? Tell us, Owen, why?
Well, one day, my business partner Rob came to me and said, I got a call from a lawyer, and he offered a certain amount of money for the name Ulysses, which we own. or we owned at the time. And I said, no way. And basically 20 times that offer. And so over 2 years, we got up to close to 20 times that initial offer, to what I consider a reasonable, payout for the name Ulysses, which we were very lucky to own. And as it turned out, in the end, the buyer of the name Ulysses was none other than Christian Mouex of Chateau Petrus, Chateau Tortenois, and Dominus in Napa Valley, where the name Ulysses is going to land.
So maybe you should have paid 200 times for it.
Well, if we had been selling 5,000 cases of it, which we weren't, we were selling 500, we would ask for a lot more.
This is a beautiful wine. I mean, this is definitely your flagship and your baby. I mean, it really is a great tasting wine.
Well, one of the things I really like about the 10 vintage is it's slightly different than the 3, 4, 5, particularly, and the 6 and 8 as well, in that a little bit more Merlot in it. Just to sort of go with the name change, Sonus is Gaelic for happiness and prosperity.
Okay.
And we tell people on the back of the label what it means.
If you're driving around the Pacific Northwest here as we approach the top of the hour, you're wondering where we're at this weekend on Northwest Vine Time. We're in South Park, just on the south side of Seattle. For those of you across Puget Sound, you know where we are, but outside of the area, right here at OS Winery with the winemaker Owen. And we're almost out of time, Owen, but before we go, I have to ask you about this red bicycle over here. You're 65 years young, and how many miles do you ride every day?
Generally 15 to 20 miles a day, 5,000 miles a year, including my 300 miles in Germany. And I love biking. As all the listeners know, driving has become increasingly difficult in our region and many parts of the country and the world. And it's a very, very good bicycle with just about the best wheels that you could get, which are critical to my kind of riding. And I've been doing it all my life. That helps. I have the moves. I may not be super fast going up hills, but I can go like 55, 60 down hills, and pretty good on the flat. But I love to ride, and the commute for many people is like, oh Christ, I have to drive. But for me, it's like, yeah, I'm on my bike.
Well, nothing like some bike riding and some wine to keep you healthy. Owen, thanks for the invite out here to OS Winery. Website oswinery.com at 1501 South 92nd Place.
One more thing. Oh, one more thing. Okay. Just one more thing. I urge you, park your car and ride.
Okay. Thanks, Owen. Thanks for the invite out here. We're at 1501 South 92nd Place, Suite B, in South Park in Seattle, and the website again, oswinery.com. I want to thank our friends at Willow's Lodge for putting us up this weekend. We'll have more with them next weekend as we continue our trek across Puget Sound here on Northwest Vine Time.